Starting now. Well, Dr. Rieger, thank you so much for taking some time to be with me today on this series that we're calling The Quest. And I like to begin by asking, how in the world are you doing in the midst of COVID-19? And what does your life look like in this moment?
Yeah, I wonder about that myself sometimes because in some ways it feels like, I'm here in my study at home. I can do my work. I do a lot of, Zooming back and forth, webinars. For me as an academic, at some level, not much has changed. And yet, on the other hand, I was supposed to be in a few different countries this summer, give lectures, presentations, would have given a presentation in Germany the other day, headed for New Zealand and Fiji. So all of that is different. So in a way, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and yet at the same time, I feel like I'm confined to my study in a way that I usually not am. So it's strange. Plus, this is a time also, to develop new kinds of relationships. So I still am not quite sure what to make of it, but here we are.
Totally. And that's been an interesting tension, I think, for so many of us in this moment of like you, lots of folks have had plans canceled and had work things that we were supposed to be about that we aren't doing. But this time has also given us some space to actually, for those of us who can do work from our desks or in our offices, be productive in new kinds of ways, perhaps. Have you seen that, or have you been giving yourself lots of grace to kind of breathe a little bit?
No, I've sort of been working probably harder than ever because there were a lot of new things to be taken care of. I'm directing a program here at Vanderbilt University, the Wendland Cook program in religion and justice, and we decided to use this time to do some outwork focusing, messaging, redesigning our website. We just finished a semester, so grading and all of that. So all of that figured in. But at the same time, also aware that we're very privileged people. If we can work from our desks, from home, safe spaces, places that a lot of other people don't have.
Totally. Well, I think that's a good perspective to keep as well. And I'm also grateful that you're able to keep producing some of this really important work. I think so much of your writing and teaching has centered around a topic that's become increasingly important, it feels like, in this moment. And that's particularly this relation of the average people with the powers that be, or of empire. And in this moment, especially for those of us in the United States, we're really seeing in a new way how selfish and greedy empire can be and how flawed it can be as we see our own government struggling to figure out how to handle COVID-19. So I wonder, from a Christian perspective, from your theological worldview, how do you process all that's happening in our country and around the world right now Christianly, if that makes sense?
The first thing to admit is everything is very confusing because on the one hand, we see these old structures of empire in full force, and that's been a lot of my work, the last maybe 15 years working on empire. Yet at the same time, it's also taking different shapes, from on the one hand, very controlling, to, on the other hand, everybody left to their own devices, people have to fend for themselves. So as we're trying to understand what's going on, it's really a day and age that seems like it's different from what we've seen before, but it also helps us, I think, see more deeply what's really going on in our own lives. Maybe the biggest thing, this is sort of something I've been thinking about a lot the past couple of weeks, is this whole notion of essential workers. Now that sounds like, this is why would the empire care about essential workers, right? The empire is usually driven from the top down. There's or people who, concentrate wealth. And the empire is always seen as, this is where it's happening. This is, all the way back to Rome, right? Caesar did this, somebody else did that, some emperor did this. And now we're seeing there people that we're now calling essential workers, right? Grocery workers, food workers, um, many others, nurses, doctors in hospitals, that are playing a role. And we hadn't paid much attention to what else is happening in the empire.
Totally. Yeah. And do you think that do you think that this new focus on kind of that working class of people that has been devalued for so long, do you think a permanent shift in our consciousness is happening in this moment about how we relate to those types of folks, or do we end up going back to kind of the same exploitative systems as before?
I think chances are we're going back to where we were before, unless we really take this moment seriously. So part of my work, and I think part of the work for people of faith really ought to be to shift some things here. But normally, the way history goes, things don't always happen by themselves. They need a little push. They need some organizing. They need some reshuffling of the powers that be. I also should go back in your first question. I didn't address your question about, what about Christians? What does this all mean for Christians? And of course, we know that Christianity grew up already, with Jesus himself under the confines of an empire. Back then, it was the Roman Empire, and it's been under the confines of empire ever since. The thing is, though, and this is what fascinates me about this empire story. I tell this story in a book, Christ and Empire, that was published already in 2007, where the story is not just about the empire, it's really about the fact that the empire can never take over the alternatives completely. So Christianity then emerges on the one hand under the empire, but also as an alternative to empire. And I think that's what's happening today. If we manage to push these alternatives, and part of these alternatives, I think, are not just ideas, but the lives of working people, what people are doing every day. I think there's a real chance that something could be different, but it will not be happen just by itself, by default.
Yeah, totally. And it seems interesting, though, as one reflects on the Christian history and tradition, that obviously there is great power within the message of Christ and what Jesus tried to begin in his life and ministry. And in that powerful movement, it has been co-opted so often by empire. And obviously empire has seen something in this Christian movement, this impulse, that it could utilize for its own benefit, not only in the Roman Empire, but we see that in the religious right of our modern era. Why do you think Christianity has been so often so vulnerable to being co-opted by empire, if it is such a powerful and liberating anti-imperial force?
So one of my definitions of empire is, back when, I put this in writing in this Christ and Empire book. I think I said empire is a conglomerate of powers that seeks to control everything. Normally, when we think of empire, we think of it as some entity that seeks to control politics, that seeks to control, wealth, economics, maybe culture, but I'm saying empire is something that seeks to control everything, and that includes religion. So there have been intentional efforts of empires all along, to co-opt whatever they would see useful to themselves. And of course, for Christianity, it took a while. Early on, the early Christians, they were not really considered all that important. Later on, sort of in the 4th century, with the Emperor Constantine, that had shifted. And so empire sort of started to make use of some of these structures that could be useful to it. That's sort of the first story. The other story, I think, is a theological one. It really has to do with how we define God. And the problem is that a lot of our notions of God are really empire notions of God. So early on, in Christianity, certainly after Constantine, you find ideas of God that very much resemble an emperor sitting on a throne. And you'll even find images of Christ and that resemble an emperor, dressed in royal robes, wearing a crown, carrying the royal insignia. Those things happen early on, and it's almost like there's sort of an attraction, to whatever is dominant, whatever is powerful in the world. That's all probably pretty normal. What I find fascinating as a theologian is that Christianity never completely succumbs to that. It never completely gives in. There's always an alternative emerging, and this is happening in history, and the great news is it's happening today. And I think that's where we need to pay more attention in this country, because we're not giving ourselves enough credit for that alternative and for being that alternative.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's beautiful and encouraging. We don't hear much good said about the church in the world today. So I think that's a really important perspective to keep. I've been really reflecting on those early stages in those first 4 centuries of Christianity, where right before it kind of gets co-opted by Emperor Constantine. And I wonder, things like Christian orthodoxy seem to have, at its very earliest forming, an imperial notion behind it, an imperial desire behind it. Constantine calls together the first council. He appoints these clerical class of religious leaders that didn't exist previously and gives them power in empire. As a theologian, that theology that emerges that we call orthodoxy, is that inherently infused with kind of this imperial notion? And should that be rethought and reformed in our day?
Yeah, this is really a great question, and what I found back when I wrote this book I just mentioned, Christ and Empire. That's not my most recent book on the topic, but it's sort of the fundamental one on this topic, because in the second chapter I'm actually dealing with the Council of Nicaea, which is the one that Constantine as emperor called, that he also presided over and determined some of the key notions. If you think about that, this is what we're now oftentimes calling orthodoxy. There's a lot of empire theology in there, so it's almost part of our Christian DNA. But the fascinating thing is, you can reread the Nicene Creed from a different perspective. So you could read, one option is to read the Nicene Creed from the perspective of empire and Constantine. Or you could read the Nicene Creed from the perspective of Jesus Christ, the life, the ministry, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. So let me give you an example of how that's different. One of the key things in this orthodox decision of the Council of Nicaea was that Jesus is really fully God. That was big question, right? Is Jesus just very special, or is Jesus actually God? So Nicaea decided Jesus is of the same substance as God, pulling the first person and the second person of the Trinity together. It's a big theological decision, a step towards the doctrine of the Trinity in the Orthodox traditions. It makes all the difference how you define the two players. So the first player, God the Father, first person of the Trinity, if you define God in terms of the emperor, somebody who sits on the throne, somebody who is omnipotent, somebody who controls everything, who is not interested or doesn't need to listen to anybody, not interested in what people think, what people do. And then you say Jesus is part of that. You're ultimately domesticating Jesus, because you have this domesticated empire God, and you're pulling Jesus into that. You can return the favor, though, and turn that around and say, well, what if we read this first person in terms of the second? So who's the second person, right? Jesus of Nazareth. His power is not top down. His power is, with the people. It is, there in the trenches. It is with working people, women, the people of his own time that were suffering under the empire. And if this is Jesus, who is changing the world in a very different way than the empire is changing it, and you now say this is of this person is of the same substance as the first person, now your whole image of God changes. So the tools of Orthodox theology, including the Nicene Creed, could really help us rethink and think differently than the empire theology out of which it emerged. That sounds a bit of a paradox, but I think it's extremely exciting because it allows us to reclaim our ancient Christian traditions in a way that make, in my view, all the difference in the world. That might have been a little bit of a complex theological explanation, but hopefully that's helpful.
No, totally. And I just wonder, what does your own spiritual and theological journey and progression look like? How did you get to this point of seeing Christianity as this or alternative to empire, I should say? What does that journey look like for you?
So I grew up in Germany. This is where that funny name and that accent comes from, right? I grew up as a German Methodist, which is a little strange because in Germany, most people, Christians, are either Lutherans or Roman Catholics. So as a Methodist, we sort of probably, what you would think of as an evangelical tradition in the United States. That is my legacy. That is my heritage. And from the very beginning, that's what evangelicals do, right? We wanted to take the Bible very seriously. It's just that we really didn't know what to do with the Bible. And so when I then began to study theology, I did a master's degree in Germany, then a PhD in the United States, and then I started teaching. Initially, I found sort of a more liberal approach very attractive. Say, well, the Bible, well, it's all metaphorical and it's nice ancient stories, and everybody does with it what they want to do with it. That's sort of a part of my own development at some level, until I realized that there's some really, really powerful stuff in the Bible. And so, I started reading the Gospels again. I started, after a while, especially doing this work on empire, started to read the Apostle Paul again, who is oftentimes seen as a conservative. It turns out Paul's actually very progressive and one of the earliest Christian anti-empire theologians. So those kinds of things to me were just fascinating discoveries. And it was a way of reclaiming the Bible. So it wasn't, the Bible is sort of now irrelevant, but it taught me things that I did not expect. And really that the evangelical tradition in which I had grown up did not teach me either. And that a lot of the liberal theological moves that I learned, later in the academy weren't very clear about either. I'll give you one example, and that's probably the most important one for me. We have all kinds of discussions in Christianity today. In United Methodism these days, we have a big discussion about LGBT acceptance and so on. Some of that is a bit strange, because if you think about how many passages in the Bible talk about LGBTI IAQ plus, those kinds of questions, there's a handful. Those are important passages. None of them, as far as I'm concerned, by the way, talk about committed same-sex relationships. They talk about abusive relationships. That could be same-sex or heterosex, by the way. But then if you go back to your Bible and you read passages that talk about poverty and justice, you'll find, literally, I'm not making this up, you'll find thousands of passages. So going back to that, to me, was just amazing, finding that God really, really cares about poverty, justice, injustice, the flourishing of people. That was, to me, probably one of the key things in my own development. And that's not something that comes just from some political commitments or some theological developments. That comes from going back and reclaiming some of our own legacy. That sounds like very biblicist, perhaps, but I think this is the way forward for progressive theology.
Totally. I love that. And I think on one hand, that's a complex journey, right? But it is also quite simple in the sense that I feel like so many people wrestle with how much the scripture talks about things that the church doesn't talk about, and how much Jesus focused on things that we don't focus on. And I wonder,
if we only had that discussion, I think, in the churches, that would be wonderful. And, there's no need to always agree on everything. That's not my point at all. But we need to have these conversations instead of, putting Jesus on a pedestal and assuming that everything is already said. That's what frustrates me really about some of the conservative traditions in not just in this country, but really globally, that claim to have a very strong theology, very strong orthodox, maybe biblical foundations. And ultimately, they don't. By the way, if I could make a quick plug here,
Yeah.
I have a book on my desk. This is my recent book on the topic Jesus versus Caesar for people tired of serving the wrong God, because I think that's what this amounts to. We're now at a place where well-meaning Christians, I'm not disputing people mean well or not, but well-meaning Christians don't even know who God is anymore. And then God looks all of a sudden like Caesar rather than like Jesus.
Yeah, totally. And it is a great book. I've started on my Kindle reading it during this quarantine. So, and it is really helpful. I think that's a helpful way of putting it, that I think so many of us don't understand the ways that empire has not even co-opted, but just become Christianity. And one thing that you talk about a lot that I think lots of folks get nervous about is how our theology and our faith needs to necessarily impact our politics. And we're in this very interesting season, right, where there's so much political division and co-opting of different issues by different groups of people. I wonder, what do you say theologically about engaging politically as followers of Jesus, especially for those who might say it looks like Jesus didn't engage all that much in the political system of his day?
Yes, yeah, thanks for that question. This is really crucial. And there are a couple of ways to respond to that. Maybe the first response I need to give, and I need to do this as somebody who grew up in Germany, with this German background. One thing I think German theology learned, or could have learned at least during the times of German fascism and the Holocaust, was that any theology is always political. Now that may come as a surprise, but what it really means is that even a theology that does not engage in politics is actually political. And what that meant for us, in the times of German fascism, was that those theologies that did not speak up against fascism, against Hitler, against the Holocaust, ultimately ended up condoning it. So it's not really a matter of having much of a choice where you could say, well, I want to be political or not. But the question is more likely, what is your politics going to be? Are you willing to address the issues that are burning off your own day, or are you not? And I think this is what you see with Jesus. He's not politicizing necessarily, but he's taken a very clear stand. He's taken a stand. Are you with me or are you not? You cannot serve God and mammon. That's another saying by Jesus that most of Christians would have heard at some point. So in this sense, that's the first response. You are political whether you like it or not. The question is, how will you be political? That's the next point. When we say you're political today in the United States, I think we've narrowed it down to the point where it's now a matter of Republicans versus Democrats. That's politics. That's one form of politics, but it's really only one part of it, because the issues are much bigger than whatever the various political players want. Politics is a matter of dealing with things public, public affairs. All of us, are affected by it. All of us are players in it, and in one way or another. And this is the bigger question. So Christians being political, the first question is not, are you Republican or Democrat, but how do you care? Do you care about public affairs? What's God have to do? How is God involved in public affairs? And I think there's an easy argument to be made in this way, to be said, if God were only interested in religion, and if you think about religion as a very narrow thing, what happens in the church or maybe a private thing, how come then God is creator of heaven and earth, right? If God is creator of heaven and earth, he is also the creator of all things public, all things economic, and there are some implications for that. Now, thirdly, what that means politically is, no matter whether Christians are Republicans or Democrats in the United States, I think there should be more options, but that's just what we have right now. Their role now in politics is not, let me say this very clearly, is not to be the cheerleader of any of the political parties. But whatever your party affiliation is, your task is to hold the feet of your party leaders to the fire, to hold them accountable, to ask whether what they're doing is actually according to the will of God or not, and not to presuppose that one or the other party is already there. That's the work that needs to be done as far as politics goes. But the real political work is much, much bigger and much more interesting than what we think of as party politics.
Totally. And part of that is there's been this historic question, not just in Christianity, obviously, but within Christian circles, about what the role of the church is versus what the role of the government is. And that goes to a whole slew of different regions of our society, meaning, should the church be the one primarily caring for those who are homeless and those who are experiencing poverty, or is that the role of the government? How do you, if somebody posing that question to you, how do you talk about that tension?
Yeah, that is another good question. So now we're getting more specific, right? What exactly is the role here? I mean, if we're thinking about politics as public matters that basically affect everybody, I mean, think about the United States, right? Anybody who lives in this country is part of it, and that's not just citizens. That's also, immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and everybody. Plus, our politics affects the world, so it's not just us. It's really even more global. Keep that in mind. And then the question is, whose role is it to take care of this business? I would say it's everybody's role. I mean, nobody can duck out and say, I do not have to care about people who are falling through the cracks. I think this is where we'd have to come back and say, maybe all of us have a responsibility. In the German, one more Germany reference here, in the German basic law, in the beginning, there's a passage that I've always found amazing. It says, Eigentum verpflichtet, and translated that means property imposes an obligation. The one who has some wealth is actually obligated by that wealth. Well, to do what? Well, to take care of the common good. And that is certainly, I would say, the task of politics. It's also the task of, well, let me say this very clearly, of people with wealth, corporations, and the church belongs there also. So the church is not excluded one way or the other, but nobody else is home free either, right? All of us, I think, are ultimately responsible for each other. That's also a great place for interreligious conversation. It's not just about, religious ideas, but the question for the religions is, how do we together contribute to the common good? So maybe use this common good notion here when you think about politics. And I think it becomes much clearer that we all have to talk about this together. Now, once we said that, there might be conversations about how could this group help more, how could that group help more. But that's how I see it. We're in this together, and there is no way to split up the responsibility and say only this group can do that or only that group can do this.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I think you clarified something which I feel like I should have learned a long time ago, but just now it's becoming clear. It's the Christian perspective on wealth then is, if I'm pursuing wealth or if I happen upon wealth, that pursuit should not be one of greed and storing up for myself, but that pursuit should be one of, if I'm accumulating wealth, it is for the common good. And I think that's really a subversive and profound different way of thinking about it. Obviously, that's not prevalent in our culture today.
It's prevalent, though. I mean, this you're right. It's not in the culture, but it's certainly in many of our religious traditions. I mean, you find this certainly in the Abrahamic traditions, and that means Judaism, Christianity, as well as Islam. You find it in other religious traditions as well. In the Christian tradition, let me push this a little bit further. This is actually what the notion of stewardship is about. Now, that's another sort of worn out notion, perhaps, that people don't think is very interesting. But think about stewardship. I mentioned earlier I'm a Methodist, so here I can quote some John Wesley. John Wesley at one point compares a steward and a proprietor, a property owner, basically. Wesley says there's a big difference between a steward and a property owner, or at one point he talks about somebody who takes out a loan, a debtor. Somebody who takes out a loan, you take a loan, and once you have whatever funds you have, you can decide what to do with them. Wesley says a steward is somebody who is never in control of the property. The steward always has to make decisions in sync with the master. The steward and the master constantly are communicating about property. And so whatever is your property is not really ever your own. If you're a steward of whatever you have, you're always having to work with this in relation to God, and of course in relation to the neighbors as well. So that completely changes some of our basic economic assumptions. So in this Jesus versus Caesar book I just mentioned, there's actually a chapter on Jesus and politics, and there's another chapter on Jesus and economics, because it has implications even for those kinds of questions that Christians sometimes would rather not discuss when it comes to questions of faith.
Totally. And I'm kind of going to wrap around to a question that I asked in the beginning and say it in a different way, because I think it's so relevant to what we're talking about right now, that in this moment of COVID-19, obviously we need to take seriously that there's pain and suffering. And it seems that it's also a moment that's giving a glimpse of what is possible, in the sense that it's possible to heal the planet. It's possible to reduce our carbon emissions. It's possible to provide healthcare. It's possible to provide a basic universal income for folks. We're seeing that happen so quickly in so many countries around the world. Sorry about that. And so I wonder, do you think that those kind of universal things that I think we're seeing are possible? Do you think that we will actually get there, or around the world, will we see more universal healthcare? Will we see a better posture towards how we deal with the earth after COVID-19?
So one thing we've seen, and I mean, I'm really glad you raised that question. Thank you so much. One thing we've seen is a lot of things are possible in many places. We may not just have to talk about Europe all the time, but very clearly, in Europe, working people are taken care of in many different ways. But you could talk about Latin America, you could talk about China, you could talk about other countries where, say, universal healthcare is already taken for granted. I mean, we're sort of the last country here in the United States. We think we're the world leader on these things, but we are actually the last developed industrialized country that does not have universal healthcare. I always find that mind-boggling. I just had to say it that way. So you can say these things have already happened in other countries. There are universal basic incomes. There's all kinds of things that are being done. But the question we need to ask, I think, that we're not asking is, how did the others get there? And sometimes we have this empire mentality where we think, oh, the Europeans got there because they have such enlightened governments. The presidents, the chancellors, industry, captains of industry, managers, CEOs. This is not how the Europeans got there. The Europeans got there the way, almost everybody else has to get there, how the Latin Americans got there, namely via people organizing, people getting together and saying, we deserve better. We need to build some power. In many cases, this is linking back to working people, labor movements, trade unions, labor unions, things that we have some trouble in the United States even addressing because people get a little nervous when that happens. But think about how we got civil rights in the United States. Yeah. Or how we got the liberation from slavery. I mean, we sometimes think there's some individual who made it all happen. But even in the civil rights movement, it wasn't Martin Luther King single-handedly, liberating us. It was a large movement of which King was a part. And not even the one who invented it, but something that he came into and that continued even after he was so horribly murdered. So in this sense, I'm hopeful that we can do these things, but in order to do it, we need to have a clear sense of who are the agents. And this is where we have to do some organizing. Here, theology helps also. What I'm saying in my most recent book there on Jesus versus Caesar is, if you think about Jesus, not just as a great preacher, that's the way we usually think, or as a wisdom preacher, as a prophet, whatnot, as the Son of God, all that is important, but think of Jesus as an organizer. Think of Jesus as somebody who is actually helping to build people power and who preaches the message that this is where you find God. So this is now a message of theology, right? Don't look up there all the time. Look around, see where is God at work, and build on that. I think that's the way forward, and that's what we could learn.
Totally, yeah. And I just want to ask a cynical question that I think some people might have. That when we look at Europe and so many of these other countries who have achieved the things that we only dream of in America, it seems that at least in this modern era, it's as countries have gotten less officially Christianized or less religious, that they've also gotten more progressive, so to speak, or guaranteeing these things for folks. Do you think that is there a parallel there? Will America need to go through a de-Christianizing process in order to get to that point?
You know, this is a question a lot of questions I've heard before. This is a question I have not heard before. So congratulations. And thanks for raising it. This is a really good question. You know, I mean, at first sight, it might look that way. And of course, I mean, I've been talking about Europe here. It might sound like I'm saying Europe is perfect. It really isn't. I mean, there's a lot of things going on in Europe that are far from perfect. And the sort of things that we're worried about here, you know, empire taking over, big money taking over, controlling all of us, you know, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. That's also happening in Europe. And I don't think that in itself is necessarily a matter of religion or no religion. I see it happening in secularized worlds. It's happening. I see it, of course, happening in the more religious climates in which we find ourselves in the United States. So in that sense, maybe what I also need to add, though, about Europe, and this is perhaps not very well known, is that there have been a lot of social religious traditions, religious socialism. Let me put this out there. There's a new Institute for Christian Socialism that you know, some of your listeners might be interested in. Check it out, Institute for Christian Socialism. This thing has deep, very deep and long roots in European Christianity. So there is a religious tradition in Germany that is very, very socially biased, socially influenced, that cares about the common good, and not just in terms of helping people, also in terms of sort of thinking about the agency of people. What can people do? You know, how can people actually contribute, make a difference? Also, you know, since we think about Republicans and Democrats here, sort of the parallel to the Republican Party in Europe, well, Germany specifically here, is called the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union. If you look at the history, I mean, these days the CDU and the Republicans look very similar. If you look at the history of the CDU, there's some real strong social Christian traditions also, where there was always a strong sense of, we are caring for the poor, we are caring for our neighbors, we want to make sure that nobody falls through the cracks, and that's also an old Christian tradition that you find in some of the conservative traditions. Unfortunately, we've lost so much of that, especially now in the United States. It might be worth reclaiming it, though. So yeah, I mean, answering your question, I'm not sure that we have to get rid of Christianity first. I think, and this is my suggestion, my personal sense is, if we could reclaim not just religion in general, but really Christianity as such, things could also be very different. And you know, I see this as one of the goals of my own work, doing that work of recovering, reclaiming, and knowing that some of it is still around, still active.
Totally. Yeah. And kind of, this will tie into that. The final two questions. One is, from where you're sitting in the world, and the work that you're doing theologically and socially, where is one particular area that you see that's giving you hope, that makes you hopeful about the direction of whether it's Christianity or America or the world? Yeah.
I really have to come back to working people. So this topic of essential workers that I mentioned earlier, they've always been essential. We're only now realizing it. So the fact that we've had these essential workers all along, and they've, not only be taking care of us, but really made some of the history that we're not even willing to tell. I mean, who built Rome? It wasn't Caesar, it was the essential workers in Rome, right? Who built the United States? Whoever made the United States great? Sorry, presidents, sorry, current one. It has always been working people. And, there's some of our dark history also. That includes people who have been enslaved tragically, but who also always have been agents. That includes women, that includes immigrants. I myself happen to be an immigrant. So looking at what's going on, and thinking that we could come back together again and start organizing again, I think this is what makes me the most hopeful. We have this new program, this new center at Vanderbilt. I just mentioned that earlier, this Wendland Cook program in religion and justice, where we're pulling together religion, questions of economics and ecology. And as we're doing that, I think, especially with an eye towards what's happening in the life of working people, I think we're seeing some changes. I'll give you some practical examples. I mean, these days we see working people organizing, standing up, to giants like Amazon, Whole Foods, Walmart. I think that's hopeful, and that's not just sort of a small step. This is really making progress that's good for all of us, for the whole country. Another thing I want to highlight, what I really find very hopeful, is there is now more and more cooperative businesses developing around the country and really around the world, where working people are getting together and say, we can make a difference together. We don't need sort of a hierarchical top-down structure. We can do things where all of us share in common decision-making, in the profit, where all of us share in making differences in the world. As Americans, we are really proud, and we should be proud of our democracy. So democracy is great. But keep in mind, democracy is not just a political thing. It can also be an economic thing. So economic democracy is something I think is very exciting. Here in Nashville, we have a new effort called the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development. Could check that out. They're doing great work, especially with minority communities, bringing working people together, building small businesses that now benefit the community rather than a few investors. All of those things, might think I'm talking now economics, but I'm ultimately really talking about the depth of what I think Christianity is all about. Because Jesus, as an organizer, bringing people together in living fruitful lives that are fruitful politically, economically. I think that's what it's all about. And here, I think ultimately we have to rethink God. That may be my concluding statement here, because too often the default mode of thinking about God still is like an emperor, still is probably more like a CEO than a working person, more like an all-powerful president than somebody who does menial labor. But if you think about images of God, certainly in the Hebrew Bible, there is many images of God doing actual work, the work of a potter, the work of a farmer, sometimes work, sewing, work that was attributed to women. In one of the creation stories, God plants a garden and builds Adam from clay, not employing working people, but joining the working majority, getting the divine hands dirty. I mean, that sort of stuff I think is fascinating, and that's where I see the hope. This is where I think ultimately we're going to make a difference.
Totally. That's so powerful and beautiful. And the last question, it's the most unfair question I always ask, but
Okay.
it's if you could pick one book of your own for folks to read as an introduction, what would that be? And if you could, what is one book or thinker that has influenced you more than anyone else that you would recommend to folks?
Well, so maybe it is this one. This is the recent one, Jesus versus Caesar.
Yeah.
Um, it is a book that I wrote for a broader audience. So the theology nerds might think, maybe I could. I mean, there's more books for the theology nerds that I've written. So just type in my name into Amazon, Joerg Rieger, and you'll find about 20 or so of them. Um, but this one I think is especially important because it's sort of the upshot of all my theological learnings. So there's a lot of my assessment of history, biblical studies, systematic constructive theology, all with an eye towards the difference it makes. Um, what thinker made the biggest difference? This is interesting. I sometimes get called a liberation theologian. I never put this label on my own books, but I don't deny it when I'm called that. So you can call me that if you like.
Yeah.
What we learned in liberation theology is that theology is really done not by some individual great minds, but really by the masses, by the people themselves. Now, theologians are part of that, so I don't want to discount the importance of theologians. But this is something I think we need to learn more, rather than thinking about one or the other great mind, thinking more about, how we all help each other to think theologically. Now, this is not a cop-out for your question. I need to say, the person that really helped me rethink that. So, I grew up in the German academy, always had this great images, great books, great actors, great theologians idea. The first theologian that sort of pushed me to rethink that was a white American liberation theologian who is mostly forgotten these days. His name is Frederick Herzog. Herzog, Herzog, who developed liberation theology in the American South, right? In North Carolina, starting in the 1960s in the civil rights struggle, which was not an easy place to do that. And he took a lot of trouble for that. But Herzog was always somebody who raised questions that I saw very few other people raise. And even though his name has been a little bit forgotten, I'm still very grateful for him. This was one of the turning points for me in my own theological development. And Herzog was somebody who really brought things back to thinking about the Bible, thinking about our deep, long theological traditions, made me do some of this hard work, reclaiming to where we're now. So yeah, check out Fred Herzog. I think there's still something to be learned.
Totally. Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been an inspiring interview, and I think it's given some hope when there's a shortage of that today. So I just really want to say, Dr. Rieger, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us on the quest today.
And you're welcome, Brandan. I enjoyed being with you, and I look forward to learning more about the work that you're doing, growing out of all of this. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Same to you.
Peace.